Good morning, everybody. Today is a new day. It's sunny New South Wales. It's lovely and warm. Look at this weather. I'm just heading out now to go and harvest some river silt from the creek. I am harvesting organic material from the property for an on-contour garden that I have been growing in for the past 3 seasons. And I previously put some chickens in there, and they scratched a whole lot of stuff around and pooped everywhere and did their job nicely. And then I had some wild birds get in there and scratch everything up too much and leveled all the beds out. And because I'm gardening on contour, I'm gardening in the center of a gully. For anyone that doesn't know what contour means, on contour it just means gardening on level. Even though when you see the garden, it's deceptive, it doesn't look level because we are gardening in the center of a gully, but each end and the middle and the whole way along each garden bed is level respective to its own garden, its own row, sorry. And that is so we can passively harvest watershed down the inside of the gully. It hits the top garden bed. There's a little trench been dug underneath every garden bed. They've been flocculated with gypsum and had organic material put in there, and because it's very clay heavy, dry, hard packed soil, or dirt type. I wouldn't call it soil, but it's a dirt type, with pockets of loamy material hither and thither, but for the most part it's a very heavy, hard soil base with inclusions of Waiatamala shale and some igneous rocks and a whole lot of other upthrust inclusions that happened hundreds of thousands of years ago when this ridge line in the southern tablelands was thrown up from volcanic eruption. So we are dealing with all those issues in the garden beds. Now I do prefer to garden straight on the ground, straight in contact with Mother Nature. If I'm going to do a raised bed, I raise it up out of organic material. I don't build it up in a structure. I like everything to breathe and, you know, be as natural within reason as I can possibly do. I like to follow the principles that nature has put forward as, you know, successful processes that it's done for, you know, millennia. So why reinvent the wheel when we can just follow suit with what Mother Nature has already done for a long bloody time. It's lovely to see that spring is here and all the wattles are flowering. That's the sunshine wattle. I believe that is the wattle that's on the Australian coat of arms. So this garden bed is for, predominantly I grow tomatoes over there and herbaceous plants throughout the springtime and early summer. And then I use it as a fodder yard. Put a cover crop down, not just for fodder, but I put a cover crop down. One, it's a nitrogen fixing cover crop that I buy. It's fairly cheap. I think it's $19 a kilo or something. And I know $12 a kilo. And it's full of legumes and other nitrogen fixers and clovers and rye and everything, good soil stabilizers. And I put the cover crop down. When it grows up to about 2 or 3 feet high, I put the chooks in there. The chooks go and do their thing. They have a great time. It takes maybe about a week, 2 weeks at best, and then I take the chooks out so they don't get a chance to eat all the organics off the surface and then break down the garden beds and scatter them out everywhere, because I like to leave them up. This year I'll be doing a better job at keeping the chows out, because they come in like in a big group of 30 birds and just eat the sides of the garden beds, chase all the bugs, pull all the organics back, and just make a big mess just before winter. So I'll be doing a better job this year at keeping the birds out with some bird netting, which I'll record, make a video of putting up all the bird netting and that whole process. So I tend to space out the plants every metre, or a metre between each plant. And then on the ground, I tend to just cover it with all herbaceous plants. I grow a lot of herbs over there for in the kitchen, a whole lot of lettuces, radishes, peas and beans all over the ground. I don't tend to do my root veggies over there just because the ground's a bit too hard and they tend to get a little bit deformed if they do come into some of that harder soil. But I've got another garden bed where I have brought in other materials and been growing more root vegetables like my turnips and Swedes and potatoes and carrots and everything, where it's a lot softer soil, still high in nutrients. We bought in some basalt soil for the potato bed, and it's quite clayey but really nitrogen rich, and every year I always put a big 200 ml layer of either clover over the top, dried clover bales, or lucerne, like as a nitrogen cover, just to mulch down for every year. And I'm a bit lazy and I tend not to take the potatoes out, all of the potatoes out, and they just come back year after year. I know we're not technically supposed to leave potatoes in the ground, but it seems to work for me. So I tend not to garden root vegetables over here, above ground, nice herbaceous plants. I have the ability to irrigate this this garden here from a pump, from a permanent water source. So if the gully doesn't harvest enough water to keep the garden green, and you can see right here in this video, like the ground inside the garden is a lot greener than the areas around it. And that is one because of the nutrients, residual nutrients that are in there from each seasons, and the cover crops, and obviously extra moisture as a result of those garden beds passively harvesting the water and spreading it out so it doesn't just run down the center of that gully. Now at the bottom of that garden I've also got a shallow well that's only about 4 feet deep, and for the most part, except for in the dead of summer, it always has water in it. That well has been a godsend for me. I get a lot of the water. If I ever have to mix up spot nutrients or a foliar spray for some of the plants that have nutrient deficiencies compared to the other parts of the garden bed, I get the water from that well. It's right there. I've got a little pot there. I can just harvest the water into a watering can, mix up my nutrients, and away we go. If you pay attention in one of the videos when I'm in the garden bed unloading, you may actually see, I might put a picture in somewhere in one of the in the clip here somewhere, but otherwise in the garden there's like a black sleeve pipe down the very end. It's the right hand side of the gate. You can see which is the lower part of the garden. It's in the lower front section of the garden bed, and that seems to have groundwater traveling into it for the most part all the time, except when we're in drought. We don't, there's not a lot of water in there all the time in the drought, but yeah, what can you do? In the early stages of the garden, before I had irrigation coming up from the permanent water source, that was paramount to me being able to irrigate. I didn't have the buggy at the time, and I was having to backpack in 20 litres of water at a time, and you can imagine, I live off grid, I grow a lot of my own food. There's a lot of plants in there, over a couple of hundred individual plants, and doing that hand watering, walking backwards and forwards, and a 200 meter trip for 20 litres of water soon became mundane and tiring. Good for your body and fitness, but not so much for your mental state. That's of course if you don't enjoy hard work. Look, I enjoy working and being active, but obviously I don't enjoy feeling laboured and encumbered all the time by heavy activity. So I do enjoy having the ability now with the buggy to move a lot more quicker and faster. And now with the excavator, I could have come down here with the excavator and probably dug the dirt, in a few hours, put it in a trailer and then hauled it back to the garden, and vice versa, unloaded it with the excavator. But I do enjoy some level of physical activity because it keeps your body in shape, and everyone likes to look good, so that's always a plus. And fitness, so yeah, these little jobs I do like to do by hand, and keeps you active in the mind. Sometimes living so remote, you need to keep mentally stimulated and physically stimulated, or you can find yourself becoming bored quite quickly, and mental boredom can drive you crazy up the wall. So I can hear people out there saying while they're watching this, why are you gardening in the centre of a gully like that? So on contour gardening is not something that's new. It's something that's caught on recently with the whole permaculture and off-grid movement for passive water collection. But you know, humans have been gardening on contour forever. Look what they do in China with rice paddies, in other countries with rice paddies. And not just the rice paddies in China, how they've managed to mountain garden monoculture for thousands of years and passively harvest the watershed off of the mountain and not allow the organic material and topsoil to erode down like we do in Western agriculture. We just strip clear, don't care for the ground and just erode everything, and we're left with nothing but clay. That's what's happened on this property 80 odd years ago when it was logged. Too much was logged. It's a steep, rigid, undulating property on a creek line with many gullies, a lot of watershed, and all the topsoil has eroded off and has ended up in the creek basin. And part of which is that silt that I'm now harvesting that has eroded off of the property into the basin of the creek. So that silt there is not part of a national park or private property or anything like that. I can hear people saying, why are you doing that there? That's silt that is collected up off the causeway after floodwaters recede and off the road edge. So it's full of nutrients from the flood. There's lots and lots of organic material in it. I'm not sure in the footage if you can see all the rotting grass, bracken fern, bits of wood and roots and other organics that have come down in the flood and mixed up into the sedimentary material, which is perfect for the style of gardening that I want. 1, it's bringing nutrients. 2, it's bringing organic material. 3, it's bringing in all that silty, nice, free draining material that'll help flocculate that clay in the garden bed that I have, even more so than it already has been by the gypsum. So it's a win-win situation. I don't have to pay for it. It's just my labour that brings it in, and I get to speed up the process in the garden of what it would take, you know, years and years and years for me to generate this kind of material just by composting in there alone. Now I can add and increase productivity in the garden for the future. So the reason why I like on contour gardening here so much is, one, I just mentioned the property is really undulated, so there is a lot of erosion that happens in the gullies. Even with the trees that are here now after regrowth, the erosion is still present in most of the gullies. You can see every time we get rain, more and more material, deeper ruts being formed. So I've started to, across the property, laying material across contour, organic material in these gullies, and building not only garden beds like this, but planting trees and berms and swales to spread the watershed out, to stop it being so fast down the property. Because gosh, when we have heavy rain, the water runs through these gullies like torrents, and you can just hear material and even hear stones clanging against each other moving downstream. And where I've put organic material and broken rotten logs across contour, you can see the silts and the fines building up and levelling out. So we're preventing erosion, building the soil back up, building organics to the ground, holding those materials back, which is then allowing the moisture to penetrate the soil, fill up the water table, spread out to the roots of the plants, and we have life. As we know, water is life. Water supports all. So the more water we can get to penetrate the soil instead of running off into the creek and ending off in Wyangala Dam, the better off the property is. Now, people might say, oh, but you're taking water out of the catchment. No, we're not. We're putting the water back into the ground where it should be prior to the project. The water still goes into the ground. It just takes longer to get there. It's cleaner when it gets there. It's been used by a myriad of organisms on its way down, and it supports the lifeblood of the ground, having proper soil hydrology. So no, we're not taking water out of the creek. In fact, in the long term, we're allowing the creek to stay flowing for a greater period of time because we're slowing the water entering the creek basin. Instead of the creek basin just filling up in flood water and emptying again and just running out into the ocean, now what happens, it flows into the soil because of the root zones, open the ground up, it penetrates, it fills the water table, it still slowly makes its way to the creek and allows the creek to flow in dry periods when there's there's no watershed. Whereas when we don't have this natural passive collection of water in the water table underground, moving slowly, our smaller mountain streams end up drying up in the summertime because there's no watershed feeding them. Whereas historically they were fed by groundwater because trees and forests and covered ground inherently traps more water into it than what exposed soil does, because it just runs off of the top of hydrophobic, really compacted, dry soil. So the more organic material, the more living mass, the more fungi, the more bacteria, the more tree roots, the more plants, the more water you get in the soil. Hence why, even though I have a main crop in my on-contour garden as my tomatoes, as what you would think of as a monoculture, the rows themselves are covered with herbaceous plants, companion planting underneath the tomatoes. In between the rows, the walkways, I have cover crop that I annually harvest or biannually harvest for green manure. So it's bioactive, full of nutrients and bacteria, and it's covered. The ground's not bare, so we don't have that evaporative effect, having exposed walkways in our gardens that are just getting baked by the sun and drawing, wicking out all that moisture, all the hard work that we put into putting that moisture in our garden beds just gets taken away by the sun if we have exposed soil even next to our garden beds. So we like to keep an organic mass the whole way through the garden. Bioactivity, abundance, and diversity are the keys to successful gardening. If in monocultures can be successful, but they predominantly use artificial means to create their success. They're using chemical fertilizers. So I started pulling the piles of dirt out into the rows where they're supposed to be, because I do this every year, using pesticides and herbicides to manage weeds and invasive insect species, invasive pests, and they're putting poisons out that are systemic, damaging to the planet and to other species. Like most herbicides and pesticides target much greater animals and plants than just the target species. So in my opinion, it's not worthwhile doing these kind of practices where they can interfere with the biodiversity of nature. So we're well and truly in the bush here. So I have to make sure that the processes that I use aren't detrimental to the greater environment. And the success of me in my endeavours is also paramount by the success of the surrounding bushland for me to be able to harvest food. So yeah, it's all about symbiosis and, you know, being diverse and living with the environment and don't fight it. Like I have to have, you can see the fence line around this garden, I have to have it fenced, otherwise I can't grow here. The animals just come in. Instead of baiting and shooting and destroying the wildlife until I'm the only thing here so I can grow my food, I just create an environment where the pests can't get in. I have a hung-over fence so the possums can't climb over. It's high enough that the wallabies can't jump into it. I have had a wombat push underneath the fence recently, but I rectified that issue. Pegged the bottom of the fence down and run an electric fence around the bottom. So it's all about human forethought. We have intelligence. We have conscience and sentient ability. So conscience and sentient ability. 17 more loads to go. So we need to use that and be smart with the way that we work with Mother Nature and not just destroy everything that we come into contact with that doesn't suit the way we want to work. Well, there's 3 rows of top dress completed. There's still to go on top of that sawdust, mulch and straw with some chicken manure. So I can't remember while I'm sitting here doing the editing if this is day 2 or day 3. I think we're at day 3 or day 2. Day 2. We'll go with day 2. Yeah, it's day 2 because the last clip was where I did the end of the rows. Those 3 rows. Yeah, so it's definitely day 2. CV joint collapsed on the red buggy on the trip, the last trip I did back to the garden. Also didn't press record on the gimbal, so I didn't get that footage, unfortunately. But here we are in the Yamaha. And the Yamaha is much more capable at hauling the material. I'm able to put a lot more in the back. Just that it's not my buggy, so the red one is, and that's why I was using the red one. But once I get the CV joint fixed, the other one is just as capable to haul the weight as this. I can haul, I think, 250 kilos in the red buggy in the back, which is more dirt than I can fit in there. But I knew the CV joint had an issue anyway. I could hear it clicking. I pulled it apart and had a look inside. I knew what the issue was, so I was expecting it to collapse regardless. I was just trying to get the most I could out of it, and yeah, there we are with the breakdown. So it's the beginning of day 3 now. Definitely day 3. It's going well. I wish it was over. I'll be happy to get over and start getting all the garden beds looking good and scratched up into a nice row. I've left it a little bit too late, really. Generally the second week of September here is around about the last frost. Sometimes they predict frosts later on in the year, so I always like to get it ready by kind of the first, make sure it's ready to go by the end of the first week, so beginning of second week in September, so I can get all my seedlings out at appropriate times. Well, we're getting close to the end of finishing off the top dress and getting ready to do the mulching. The mulching will be in another video. Here we are, 3 days later, with the top dress completed on all 6 rows. So we're about 2 feet at the bottom of the row and 250 to 300 mil high. So these garden beds will have another 250 mils of loose mulch and straw put over the top with some chicken manure, just to aid helping in keep moisture in the garden beds, and the organics over time break down and add nutrients. The chicken manure will break down and add nutrients. It also, the smell of it also helps encourage bugs and worms into the soil, and that in turn increases fertility and the longevity of your garden. The goal is, in the end, for a low input gardening method in here. That's why I've got all the grass, and there are legumes and other nitrogen fixers growing in between the rows as well that I use as a green mulch layer annually. I chop it down. This year I fed it to some chickens and they pooped everywhere and scratched everything around, so I don't have that mulch layer. That's why I've rebuilt the garden beds up again. So now we come into the new season. Hopefully this year is productive in the garden.